The phrase everyone grew up hearing rolls off the tongue like a final verdict. 10 tribes lost forever, vanished into the winds of history. Yet the official story never matched the evidence scattered across broken steles, sacred texts, and family memories whispered over Sabbath candles. The northern kingdom fell in 722 BCE, but the trail did not evaporate. It splinters into roads that run east into Assyrian provinces, south along Red Sea trade routes, and quietly back toward Jerusalem's gates, where unexpected names still appear in the biblical record centuries later. The biblical core of this claim stands solid. 2 Kings 17 records the fall of Samaria under Assyrian pressure. Shalmaneser V began the siege. Sargon II finished the job, his inscriptions written in the unforgiving wedge marks of cuneiform spell out a number that refuses to be ignored. 27,290 inhabitants of Samaria deported, not folklore, an imperial tally. Deportations had already begun under Tiglath-Pileser III in 732 BCE from Galilee and Gilead. Assyrian policy preferred displacement, not annihilation. Uproot, scatter, replace. New settlers were brought into Samaria from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. The people of Israel were moved to Halah, Habor by the river of Gazan, and to the cities of the Medes. The northern tribes absorbed a blow designed to erase political identity and fracture memory. But an unexpected detail surfaces in Chronicles, like a face recognized in a crowded room. After Samaria's collapse, King Hezekiah's reform in Judah sent letters north and south with an invitation to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. The chronicler records that people from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came. That sentence disrupts a simplistic narrative. The map had been redrawn, but the families did not vanish. In the days of Josiah, offerings were collected from Manasseh, Ephraim, and the remnant of Israel. And in Brahman, Chronicles 9:3, inhabitants of Jerusalem included people from Ephraim and Manasseh living beside Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites. The neat boundary lines of lost and found dissolve under biblical ink. Assyria never intended to invent a mystery that would grip minds for 3,000 years. The empire wanted compliance, yet the reality of forced migration is messy. Some fled south into Judah, some hid in rugged hills, some melted into the urban bustle of Nineveh and the rural rhythms along the Khabur River. Northern Israelite identity did not disappear. It dispersed, thinned, resurfaced, and mingled. Some of it settled directly next door, and right there, on the slopes of a hill opposite Mount Ebal, the descendants of Joseph held fast to a Torah written in a script priestly scholars now call ancient. The Samaritans claim continuity from Ephraim and Manasseh, specifically from those who avoided exile and married within the land. Their own text emphasizes Mount Gerizim as the chosen site. Their ritual calendar still marks Passover with a living sacrifice at twilight on that holy mountain. Their Torah scrolls gleam with the austere beauty of a separate yet parallel stream of Israelite faith. The old argument with Jerusalem never died, and neither did the people who carried it. Josephus, the first-century historian, wrote with the breezy certainty of a man who has stood at Rome's center and seen the world funnel toward him. He noted that the 10 tribes were then beyond the Euphrates, an immense multitude. That line stands like a signpost along the road east. His phrase did not point to a far-off myth. He was describing a population known to his time. Jewish communities in Mesopotamia and Media thrived for centuries. Persian Aramaic words still echo within Jewish liturgy. The thread is firm enough to hold. And then, a quieter testimony slips in from the New Testament and refuses to be ignored by anyone serious about sources. In Herod's temple courts, a prophetess named Anna appears in Luke 2:36, explicitly identified as from the tribe of Asher. Northern blood had not vanished in the age of Augustus. In the book of Acts, Paul speaks of the hope to which our 12 tribes strive night and day. The Epistle of James addresses the 12 tribes in the diaspora. The vocabulary of the apostles assumes continuity, not fantasy. The surviving remnants were acknowledged as a living reality, even if scattered. The Samaritans stand as one of the clearest lines of survival, regardless of rabbinic polemics or later quarrels. Modern genetic studies add a layer of light. Samaritan paternal lineages cluster with Levantine populations. Their priestly family shows close affinities to the ancient Near East, with lineages that run near the Jewish priestly lines. Culture, scripture, ritual, and DNA align to preserve a witness to Joseph that never left the ridges of Samaria. That reality alone explodes the cartoon of total disappearance. And then, as the centuries turned and empires rose and fell, new rumors took flight. Late Jewish apocrypha, composed under the weight of Roman domination, floated the idea that the 10 tribes withdrew to a secluded region called Arsareth. The author of 2 Esdras spoke like a poet who needed a horizon beyond the ruins. The scene mattered because it set imaginations running along the tracks of the Silk Road, beyond Persia, beyond deserts, into the folds of mountain spines and far river valleys no Roman had mapped with confidence. Medieval Jews and Christians took the hint and began to search with parchment and ink. Rabbinic lore added another piece. The Sabbatean river that roared impassively 6 days a week and miraculously rested on the Sabbath, a haunting image of a boundary preserved by sacred time. The legend appears across late antique literature. It functioned as a spiritual compass, not a Google pin, a physical barrier that eased weakly on the very day one could not cross it, created a paradox tailor-made for a people accustomed to living with tension. Medieval travelers wrote about it as though they had glimpsed its stones, leaping against the current of history itself. A 9th-century traveler named Eldad Hadani arrived in North Africa with reports that tied tribal memory to real geography. He claimed origins in the tribe of Dan and described fellow Israelites living beyond Ethiopia and Arabia, governed by their own laws and guided by a Hebrew tongue untainted by foreign speech. Eldad's testimony reads like a dispatch from the edges of the known world. Geonim engaged his claims seriously. The story walked into the record with enough authority to spark centuries of pursuit, even when later scholars became more skeptical. By the 12th century, the Spanish Jewish traveler, Benjamin of Tudela, logged Jewish communities from Zaragoza to Baghdad, from Persia to somewhere near China, naming populations that persisted in the shadow of caravans and imperial toll gates. His book mentions peoples rumored to be from Reuben and Dan somewhere beyond Persia, enclosed by mountains or separated by violent rivers. He recorded hearsay alongside eyewitness detail, weaving a cultural atlas that proved 2 things at once. Jews lived nearly everywhere, and stories about lost tribes drifted just beyond the reach of certainty. And still the biblical record kept tugging the thread back toward Judea. Names of northern tribes surfaced at the margins of temple stories and apostolic letters, insisting that the line had not been cut. The search moved in 2 directions at once: east toward legend, south toward lands Eldad and Ethiopian chronicles described with unflinching confidence. The next chapter unfolded under African skies. In the highlands of Ethiopia, a community kept the Sabbath with fervor, read from a law called the Orit, and honored kosher distinctions with an ancient care that never passed through the Talmudic academies of Babylonia. The Beta Israel, known to outsiders as Falasha, a term they did not choose, preserved a biblical rhythm that felt like a preserved branch rather than a graft. Their traditional origin narratives speak of a connection to the tribe of Dan, and medieval Jewish sources like Eldad Hadani fed that association. The Ethiopian national epic, the Kebra Nagast, tells another story, linking the kingdom to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, though the Beta Israel's own religious matrix sits distinctly within the biblical frame rather than the Solomonic romance. Modern halakhic rulings brought clarity and a new urgency. In 1973, Rabbi Ovadiah Yosef, then Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, affirmed that Beta Israel are descendants of Israel, effectively bringing them under the law of return, while recommending a symbolic conversion to sidestep uncertainties introduced by long geographic isolation. 2 dramatic airlifts followed. Operation Moses in 1984 carried approximately 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel through a daring route from Sudan. Operation Solomon in May 1991, over a breathtaking 36 hours, brought about 14,325 more in a single cascade of flights as Ethiopia's political situation trembled. The image of mothers stepping onto the tarmac with babies in arms, under a flag emblazoned with a Star of David, seared itself into collective memory. Genetic studies of Beta Israel reflect deep roots in the Horn of Africa, with some detectable Middle Eastern signals. The picture suggests a complex formation that likely includes ancient Israelites embedded within Ethiopian history, along with centuries of local marriage and cultural evolution. The data refuse simplistic headlines, while reinforcing the axis of connection. The core of their identity was never a late fantasy. It was a preserved covenantal life, forged in an African crucible, farther south, among the Lemba of Zimbabwe and South Africa. Another memory held with startling firmness. The Lemba recite a tradition that their ancestors came from a place called Sena, often associated with Sana'a in Yemen. Their priestly Buba clan bears a name that resonates with ancient titles. They practice circumcision, avoid pork, maintain endogamy, and preserve ritual norms that set them apart from surrounding communities. Tudor Parfit's research in the late 20th century pushed the story into scientific light. DNA studies found a significant presence of Near Eastern Y chromosome lineages among the Lemba, and within the Buba clan, a notable proportion of men carried a pattern closely related to the so-called Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic signature concentrated among Jewish priestly families with roots in the Near East. The Lemba keep a revered object they call the Ngema Lungundu, the drum of the ancestors, which some identified with the memory of the Ark. Parfit traced an artifact by that name and found a crafted wooden object in a Zimbabwean museum. Carbon dating placed it in the medieval period, around the 14th century. The object itself is not from the time of Moses, but it functions as a tangible memory vessel. In stories carried by elders and ritual acts guarded by careful hands, a Middle Eastern origin pours through a distinctly African vessel. The result is not a parlor trick. It is a cultural survival underlined by genetic hints that point toward a Semitic source at the root. South Arabian Jews historically traversed the Red Sea's trade corridors, moving between the highlands of Yemen and the Horn of Africa. The idea that Israelite groups could have crossed from Arabia into the African interior aligns with known patterns of ancient trade. The Lemba thread anchors that possibility in living people who still hold on to a law of fathers they refuse to abandon. Their story refuses to be shelved under folklore, and the Indian subcontinent waited with another set of clues held by fisherfolk who recited the Shema in Marathi, by spice traders praying under blue and white tiles, and by hill tribe communities in the far northeast, who sang Hebrew psalms amid bamboo thickets and mountain rains. On the Konkan coast of western India, the Bene Israel tell of an ancient shipwreck that left a handful of survivors clinging to the rocks. One group that never forgot the Shema. Centuries later, they lived as oil pressers and fishermen, keeping Sabbath and dietary laws with fragments of Hebrew that their neighbors heard as a familiar rhythm in an unfamiliar tongue. By the 18th and 19th centuries, contact with other Jewish communities sharpened their memories into standardized practice. Synagogues rose from the coconut groves, and prayers written in Hebrew took root in Indian soil. Modern genetic analyses suggest Middle Eastern paternal lineages interwoven with local Indian ancestry, a pattern entirely consistent with a small Near Eastern founding population marrying into local communities over long stretches of time. Far south, on the Malabar coast, the Cochin Jews maintained an ancient presence. The Paradisi Synagogue in Madancherry, founded in 1568, stands as a jewel of Indian Jewish history, with Dutch-style blue and white tiles underfoot and a perpetually burning lamp said to have never been extinguished. Older traditions connect Jewish trade with the Indian Ocean back to the time of Solomon, when fleets reached Ophir and Tarshish. While inscriptions cannot draw a straight line from 10th century BCE Jerusalem to 16th century Cochin, the long memory of trade between the Levant and India gives the geography a durable logic. The Jewish communities of India evolved with layers. So-called white Jews arriving from Iberia and the Middle East after expulsions, black Jews of ancient local origin, and the Bene Israel forming a distinct third branch with its own liturgical nuances. In the distant hills of Manipur and Mizoram, along the India-Myanmar border, a different claim emerged in late modernity. The B'nai Menashe, drawn from the Kuki-Chin Mizo peoples, preserve oral traditions of migration that they connect to the exile of Manasseh. Over the centuries, they maintained customs reminiscent of biblical laws and, in the 19th and 20th centuries, embraced Christianity with a fascination for Israelite identity. In the late 20th century and early 21st, under guidance from organizations like Shavei Israel and rulings by Israel's chief rabbinate, the Bnei Menashe were recognized as Zerah Yisrael, people of Israelite seed. Many underwent formal conversions under rabbinic supervision, with thousands immigrating to Israel. Genetic studies of the Bnei Menashe show profiles typical of East Asian populations, with only faint Near Eastern signals. That result confirms a complex reality. Their Jewishness today rests on self-conscious return, organized study, practice, and conversion rather than an unbroken genetic chain. Yet their story matters for another reason. The hunger for home expressed in their liturgy and the discipline of their practice arose from a memory they believed was more than metaphor. They did not hitch a ride on a trend. They chose a path, and Israel made room. Across this entire Indian arc, Jews have left a record of weddings sung in Marathi, deeds recorded in Judeo-Malayalam, and Torah scrolls carried through monsoon rains. The Bene Israel and Cochin Jews emigrated by the thousands to Israel in the mid-20th century, patches of India stitched into the quilt of the ingathering. The Bnei Menashe took their place in that story, anchored not by laboratory results, but by credible rabbinic process. Each thread refracts a prism of 10 tribes' narratives in a way that breaks the tidy myth and replaces it with verifiable complexity. The search trail pushes back north and east into zones that ancient prophets called Media, and that modern maps label Iran, Iraq, and beyond. Suddenly, the lost tribes are not a rumor anymore. They look like neighbors who stayed put for 2,700 years, until expeditions and expulsions moved them again. The Assyrian record did not scatter Israel into a fairy tale. It placed Israelite families in specific provinces with names that still map onto landscapes you can stand on. Hala and Gozan lie along the Kabur River in what is now northeastern Syria. The cities of the Medes correspond to northwestern Iran, places like Hamadan, and the lands surrounding the Zagros Mountains. Those hills and plateaus nurtured Jewish communities for over 2 millennia. The tomb of the prophet Nahum stood at Al-Kosh, near ancient Nineveh, preserved by Kurdish Jews, who recited psalms under a ceiling that cracked as a rock shifted underneath them. The tomb of Esther and Mordecai in Hamadan gathers prayers to this day. The Kurdish Jews spoke dialects of Jewish Neo-Aramaic that ring with the sounds of the ancient Near East. Their customs retained distinctly Israelite features, seasoned by Persian culture. In the 20th century, nearly all Kurdish Jews left for Israel, carrying with them a heritage many believed flowed in part from those ancient northern deportations. That belief does not require hallucination. Isaiah and Nahum spoke to and about places embedded in Assyrian geography. The Book of Tobit, in the Apocrypha, places a northern Israelite exiled under Tiglath-Pileser III, living in Nineveh, navigating life under Assyrian eyes. The line from Samaria to Kurdistan is the opposite of speculative. It is historically thick. Farther northeast, in Central Asia, the Bukharan Jews formed a vibrant community that spoke Tajik Persian and created a unique synthesis of halakha and local custom. Their origins trace back to Persian Jewry, which itself emerged from the Babylonian exile. The chain from Judah's exile is clearest there, but the northern deportations almost certainly reinforced the Jewish presence in the same broad sphere. Between the 5th century BCE and the Islamic Golden Age, the Silk Road carried merchants and messengers, rabbis and Qur'an readers, new communities and renewed communities, across deserts and oases, where Chinese characters and Hebrew letters sometimes ended up on the same ledgers. The story of the Khazars, a Turkic polity northeast of the Black Sea that converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century, adds another layer to this map without solving the lost tribes puzzle. The Khazar elite's adoption of Judaism is attested in the Khazar correspondence and in Judah Halevi's philosophical work, the Kuzari. That conversion does not equate to descent from the 10 tribes. Modern genetic studies of Ashkenazi Jews point primarily to a mix of Levantine and Southern European ancestries, with no dominant Central Asian or Turkic signal that could stand in for a mass Khazar origin. The Khazar story is dramatic and important for Jewish history, but it does not function as a satisfying answer to the lost tribes' allure. Meanwhile, a 12th century Jewish community in China left steles carved with Hebrew and Chinese, telling of ancestors who settled in Kaifeng during the Song dynasty. Their Torah scrolls looked like theirs and like yours, if you read them in a synagogue anywhere else. They represent the reach of diaspora life, not necessarily the 10 tribes. Benjamin of Tudela's remarks about Jews beyond Persia echo in their direction, reminding everyone that a caravan's last stop could easily become a permanent home. Modern movements like British Israelism tried to bulldoze all of this nuance. In the 19th century, writers such as John Wilson and later Herbert W. Armstrong floated the notion that the British and Americans descended directly from the 10 tribes. They saw Saxons as Isaac's sons and traced Dan to Denmark and the Danube. Linguists rolled their eyes, and geneticists, when they joined the conversation in the 20th and 21st centuries, mapped out Y chromosome and mitochondrial lineages that tied the British Isles firmly to Western Europe, not to the Levant. The appeal of those ideas did not spring from fidelity to evidence. It sprang from a hunger for chosenness, dressed in imperial clothing. Evidence cut it down to size. Yet the hunger itself kept peering east, beyond familiar empires, through mountain passes, searching out tribes whose elders told stories that would not die even if science raised its eyebrow. Some of those stories held ancient weight. Some needed to be sifted with care. In the high valleys flanking the Hindu Kush, Pashtun genealogies sometimes claim descent from the Israelites. The 17th century Persian chronicle Maksan Afghani framed Afghan origins in this way, even including a line to King Saul. Tribal names, such as Yusufzai, sound tantalizingly similar to Joseph's sons, to ears tuned for echoes. Customs like circumcision and Levirate marriage appear, though these also sit well within Islamic law and broader Near Eastern tradition. The claim resonates in oral history and in the proudly kept daftar of tribal lineages. Genetic studies, however, generally place Pashtun populations within the spectrum of South and Central Asian peoples, while some Near Eastern haplogroups such as J2 do appear as part of a broader West Eurasian layer. There is no dominant Levantine signal that would stamp the population as a relocated Israelite tribe. That does not invalidate the cultural memory. It reframes it as a noble genealogy that confers identity and cohesion in a region where ancestry speaks as loudly as law. The Pashtun story adds texture to the conversation, not a definitive answer. In West Africa, parts of the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria have embraced Judaism with energy and seriousness. Oral traditions in some communities connect them to Gad, Dan, or Levi. Colonial-era writers sometimes amplified these claims, and modern Igbo Jews have crafted vibrant synagogues and rituals that draw deeply from Tanakh. Genetic research typically aligns the Igbo with West African populations, without a strong Middle Eastern signal. That finding does not measure sincerity or cancel the force of chosen practice. For many, Jewish identity entered through self-awareness, study, and commitment more than biology. Israel's process of recognition has been cautious, with some Igbo Jews converting under rabbinic supervision. Meanwhile, the Samaritans continue as a small but fiercely enduring people, now numbering around 850, split between Holon near Tel Aviv and Kiryat Luza on Mount Gerizim. They still perform the Passover sacrifice at twilight, on the very hill that their Torah magnifies. Their priesthood descends through male lines carefully documented. Genetic studies underline their continuity with other Levantine populations, including a close relationship to Jewish Kohanim, while also showing the effects of centuries of endogamy. If any community can stand and say that Ephraim and Manasseh never disappeared from the land, it is theirs. Yemenite Jews offer another ancient line. Operation Magic Carpet in 1949-1950 airlifted roughly 49,000 Yemenite Jews to Israel in months that felt miraculous to those who had sung about Zion with a longing that could break a heart. Yemenite communities carried traditions that echo deep antiquity, with phonetic preservation of Hebrew sounds and liturgies that preserve ancient melodies. The old lore that linked some Yemenite lineages to Dan or to Rechabites intersects in curious ways with Eldad Hadani's 9th century testimony, placing some tribes in Arabia and beyond. Historic connections between Judah, Levi, and their communities remain clearer, but the corridors between Yemen and Africa keep that Danite whisper alive as part of a broader tapestry. With each case, the patterns repeat. Oral tradition offers a path. Ritual habit provides a scaffolding. Textual references lend legitimacy. Genetic testing either supports in part, remains inconclusive, or demands a new interpretive frame. The outcome rarely resolves into a headline. It opens into a room with walls covered in maps and a floor laden with scrolls and lab reports, each contributing a fragment that refuses to be dismissed. The Bible itself keeps the argument alive and honest. Ezekiel 37 offers the vision of 2 sticks, one for Judah, one for Joseph, that become one in the prophet's hand. The prophetic message proclaims reunification under a single shepherd. That sign acts as the theological anchor of any conversation about scattered tribes. The destiny of Israel is not permanent fragmentation. The diaspora is a chapter in an unfinished story that bends toward return and oneness. History shows the beginnings of that reunification occurring long before modern flights. After Assyrian deportations, families from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun walked south to Jerusalem and joined a Judah that was itself on the brink of Babylon's furnace. By the time Ezra read the law, the people gathered included returnees from Judah and Benjamin and Levites by explicit mention, but the deeper reality encompassed households whose grandfathers or great-grandmothers had moved quietly during Assyrian chaos. First-century Jerusalem still held someone from Asher since Anna stood in the temple courts. Paul could speak of 12 tribes in the present tense. James could write to them scattered among the nations. Rabbinic literature even preserves a debate about whether the 10 tribes will return. Recorded in the Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin 110b, indicating that the possibility remained central to Jewish thought. Modern genetics shines a new light, without dictating a final answer. Certain Jewish male lineages carry Y chromosome markers J1p58 and J2 with the so-called Cohen modal haplotype appearing at elevated frequencies among families historically identified as Kohanim. Among Ashkenazi Levites, a distinctive R1A branch points to a founder event in the medieval period, grafted onto an ancient line. The point is not to hand out tribal ID cards based on sequences. It is to note that worldwide Jewish populations share a common Levantine core that coheres across time and distance. The priestly line, in particular, travels like a scar of continuity across continents. That fact carries theological and historical force, even if it cannot sort Ephraim from Manasseh with laboratory precision. The 20th century ingathering translated prophecy into airport logistics. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah airlifted approximately 120,000 Iraqi Jews to Israel in 951-952, emptying Babylonian synagogues, where prayers had risen since the days of Ezra. Moroccan, Tunisian, and Algerian Jews arrived by the tens of thousands. Soviet gates cracked in the late 1980s and 90s, sending a flood of Russian-speaking Jews to Tel Aviv. Each flight, each convoy, wrapped up centuries of waking and sleeping memory. Together they formed a living answer to Ezekiel's two sticks. Judah and Joseph, separated by exile and empire, stood again on the same ground, under the same sky, praying in accents different enough to make people smile and close enough to make them cry. The most astonishing truth begins to take shape like an image emerging in a dark room tray. The 10 tribes did not disappear as much as diffuse. They fractured under Assyria. Some survived in place among the Samaritans. Some moved south and merged with Judah in a complicated family reunion that began in the days of Hezekiah and never really stopped. Some ended up east and northeast in Media and Persia, forming part of the durable scaffolding of Babylonian and then Persian Jewry. Others drifted along trade routes to India and even China, not as 10 intact units but as sparks carried by caravans. In Africa, Beta Israel and the Lemba preserved practices and memories, with enough grit to withstand the eroding winds of centuries, with genetic and cultural data supporting a connection that lines up with known corridors of movement. This answer pushes back against tidy narratives that promise an exact address for each tribe on a modern map. It offers something richer. The tribes are found in the people who kept the covenantal core alive under every empire that tried to make them forget. They are found in the Samaritans, who still slaughter lambs at twilight, in Ethiopian Jews, whose Orit carried Sinai's words in Ge'ez, in Lemba elders who tell their grandchildren they came from across the sea, and then dance at weddings beneath a canopy held by 4 poles, and hope in Bene Israel families who still cook Indian curries for Shabbat, and still name their sons David and their daughters Esther, in Kurdish grandmothers who prayed over oil lamps as the hills turned gold. The archaeology laces through the story as well, not as a scattering of museum pieces, but as living context. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III depicts Jehu, king of Israel, prostrate before Assyria in 841 BCE, reminding everyone that the northern kingdom lived under Assyrian pressure long before the final collapse. The Nimrud prism of Sargon II confirms the deportation from Samaria, fixing that 27,290 figure into immovable stone. The Sennacherib reliefs at Nineveh show the siege of Lachish in Judah, an icon of imperial wrath, and remind anyone paying attention that both northern and southern kingdoms felt Assyria's hand in their ribs. The Elephantine papyri from Egypt present a Jewish community in the 5th century BCE, living and praying in a garrison on the Nile, outside both Judah and Samaria, functioning as a diaspora node that predates many medieval fantasies. In Mesopotamia, the Al-Yahudu tablets document Judean exiles in Babylonia after 586 BCE, showing families adapting to new economic realities while maintaining distinct identity, names like Yashar and Natan carved into clay. While those documents concern the exiles of Judah rather than northern Israel, they reveal the machinery by which exiles survived without vanishing. A people can be displaced and still raise children who remember the stories that make them who they are. That lesson applies across every stream of Israel's scattering. The deportations unfold on a precise timeline. 732 BEC sees Tiglath-Pileser III's campaigns into Israel's northern territories, with deportations that carve up Galilee and Transjordan. 722 BCE marks the fall of Samaria to Shalmaneser V and Sargon II, with population transfers recorded in Assyrian annals. 701 BCE brings Sennacherib up to the gates of Jerusalem, an attack that leaves Judah staggering but unbroken. 586 BCE brings Babylon's final blow, sending Judeans east. Each date injects movement into the bloodstream of Israel. Few families trace their lines cleanly through all of this without crossing from one tribal identity into another. The most likely outcome over centuries is the very one the evidence shows. Northern elements blended into Judah. Judah carried the combined story forward, and then the road continues up through late antiquity, where rabbinic debates framed the 10 tribes with sobering realism. Some sages voiced despair that they would not return, citing verses about the waters of the Euphrates washing them away. Others insisted on a return, leaning on promises of restoration that ring like iron. The tension between those positions is not a bug in the tradition. It is the point. The argument preserves space for communities encountered across time to be gathered in fact or in law, by finding in them an old flame or by kindling a new one. Under the Ottoman and Persian empires, Jewish communities along the Khabur and across Kurdistan hold their place. In the mountains of Duhok and the streets of Sanandaj, the expected cycle plays out. Boys become men under a chuppah. Girls become women under the humming canopy of women's songs. And Hebrew remains the language of prayer, even if daily commerce flows in Kurdish Arabic or Persian. By the mid-20th century, these communities join the ingathering. Old houses are locked. New apartments open. 2 sticks inch closer, not through miracles alone, but through agency, decisions, and the steady churn of history. Through all these corridors, a final clarity emerges. The search for the 10 tribes turns into a mirror. It reflects more about the human hunger for origin and return than about cartographic precision. But the mirror does not lie. It shows ancient Israelite lineages alive in places the prophets named. It shows a Samaritan priest raising a lamb's head to the sky. It shows an Ethiopian mother teaching her child the Shema. In a Hebrew she learned from a book carried across a desert. It shows a Lemba elder reciting the law of purity before a communal feast. It shows a Bene Israel father chanting a blessing in a cadence that traveled oceans and centuries to find its way back to a living room in Haifa. Observers who chase a singular headline miss the wonder embedded in the sources. The 10 tribes are found in multiple ways at once. Found in the group that never left Samaria. Found in the Judean fold that expanded and redefined what a Jew meant while holding the covenant shape. Found in diaspora communities whose stories align with forced migration toward Assyria and then toward Persia. Found in maritime routes that tie Yemen, Ethiopia, and the Indian coast into a web of kinship. Found in echoes that genetics catches as it listens to chromosomes, even as it admits the limits of its vocabulary. The word tribe shrinks under modern microscopes. The biblical narrative resists shrinking. Credible scholarship holds this line. The majority of the northern kingdom's population did not reassemble as distinct tribes under their ancient names after 722 BCE. They absorbed, intermarried, shifted south, and scattered east. Some crystallized as Samaritans in the others absorbed into Judah and became part of a larger Jewish people that bore the names of Judah and Benjamin, because those were the surviving political entities, not necessarily because other tribal blood had vanished. Skeins of identity unraveled and were rewoven around temple, Torah, language, and law. Tribal labels lost their administrative function. Memory took over, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly. Yet the astonishment remains. The hope of reunification persisted as a touchstone of theology. Ezekiel's 2 sticks remain in the hand of anyone reading, a sign that identity reconstructed by covenant is as real as identity delivered by genes. The diaspora return of the 20th century filled the land with accents from Aleppo, Fez, Vilnius, Mashhad, Sana'a, Addis Ababa, Mumbai, and Samarkand. Each family carried stories that bled across tribal lines, bringing to life a sense of 12 that cannot be pinned to a particular census. Those who declare the 10 tribes found by pointing to a village and a headline oversimplify. Those who declare them lost forever ignore the living people who never stopped embodying northern Israel's fragmentary survival. The truth, far more compelling than any one location discovery, reads like a biblical narrative extended into the present, scattering, sifting, surprising survivals, and a promised return that takes shape through airplanes, court rulings, synagogue dedications, and children learning to read Hebrew at kitchen tables. One more thread draws everything together. The priestly line encoded in ancient Israel's structure carries through in real time. The Cohen modal haplotype does not draw tribal borders on a map. It instead operates like a stamp of continuity, marking families spread across Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Samaritan communities that remember who traces their line to Aaron. That small, statistically strong signal functions as a proof-of-life indicator for the larger claim of continuity stretching back to Sinai. If that line survives fire, exile, forced conversion, poverty, and modernity, then other lines less distinct, more interwoven surely survive within the Jewish people as a whole. Stories about the Sambation River still circulate, not as cardinal directions but as poetic scaffolding for a yearning that refuses to collapse. The river that hurls stones 6 days a week and rests on the 7th stands as a metaphor for a world that fights and rages and refuses passage until one day it lines up with heaven's rhythm. The river rests, but the law commands rest, so the people stop. A boundary remains, both sacred and crushing. At its far bank, some imagine tribes keeping the Sabbath with perfect joy, unable to return until time itself moves differently. That legend holds power because it captures the paradox at the heart of Jewish history. The way back opens and closes in patterns not controlled by kings or armies. The chronicles of Eldad Hadani and Benjamin of Tudela maintain their place, not because they provide GPS coordinates, but because they recorded an unbroken habit of expecting Israel in the world. They named names, mapped rumors, and honored the possibility that a man on a dusty road might be a descendant of Asher or Reuben, still holding fast to something ancient. Medieval readers wanted those travelers to be right, because the hope built into the Bible wanted them to be right. The farthest stories were not escapism. They were prophecy's long echo. Under colonial empires, missionaries and scholars sometimes distorted these narratives, projecting European fantasies onto indigenous communities. The result confuses the modern observer, trying to discern truth from romantic overreach. Yet, stripping away the wishful thinking leaves a core of data that holds. Beta Israel's halakhic recognition and airlifts. The Lemba's genetic signals and ritual practices. The Bene Israel's documented worship over centuries, and their blend of Middle Eastern and Indian ancestry. The Samaritans' living sacrifice and unshaken claim to Josephite lineage. The Kurdish Jews' Aramaic prayers that sound like whispers from the Book of Daniel's Babylon. The Pashtun and Igbo claims, significant for cultural self-definition, sorted carefully by genetic and historical evidence that refuses to rubber-stamp sensationalism. The habit of historians and biblical scholars in the 21st century is to adjust the lens. Gone are the broad strokes that draw straight lines from tribe to modern nation. In their place arrive carefully cross-checked footnotes, isotope analyses, DNA haplogroup frequencies, inscriptions angled under infrared light, and the maturity to say two things at once. The 10 tribes did not reassemble as 10 named tribes, stone for stone, and man for man. The lineages of northern Israel survived in multiple forms, some plainly visible, some integrated into Judah, some crystallized in local pockets, many diffused into the broader Jewish ethnos that the world now knows simply as Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. At ground level, inside kitchens and courtyards and courthouses, everything looks simpler. People circumcise their sons on the 8th day. They avoid certain foods. They bury their dead, facing a certain way, and recite Kaddish with trembling voices. They read Genesis aloud and speak about Jacob's blessings, Joseph's dreams, and Moses' voice echoing off stone. They board planes with one suitcase and a plastic bag bulging with documents, or they stay in place and keep lighting the same lamps on Friday night because those lamps refuse to go out. The old question dissolves into a statement that carries soft thunder. The lost tribes are not a scavenger hunt item waiting to be found behind a single door. They are a saga braided into the life of the Jewish people and the Samaritans, layered with African, Asian, and Middle Eastern geographies. The astonishment lies in the survival itself and in the pattern of the survival. Deportation did not break the story. It changed the story's grammar. Names of tribes receded. The name of Israel remained. Modern Israel's return serves as a physical theater where this grammar becomes visible. A Samaritan priest recites ancient prayers at Mount Gerizim's Passover, while, a few hours away, Beta Israel synagogues in Beersheba chant melodies that tremble with Ethiopian cadence. A Lemba student visits Jerusalem, places a note in a Judean wall, and pulls his phone to call home across a continent. B'nai Israel families gather in Lod to sing Hodu Lashem Ki Tov with Marathi warmth. Kurdish Jews revive piyutim that once floated across the Great Zab River and now rise over the hum of urban traffic. Lines that felt broken to empires play as music to anyone listening. The tribes of Israel were carried into exile by an empire intoxicated with its own power. The records carved in stone swear that this happened. The prophets warn that exile would come and whisper that return would follow. The poets and historians of late antiquity conjure images of rivers that hurl stones and far lands reserved for a people whose name refuses erasure. The medieval travelers sketch maps that turned rumor into itinerary. The modern era draws planes across skies, frames faces in the glow of welcome signs, and invites ancient words to be spoken in a land that always knew they would return. The astonishment is not a sudden discovery, but an accumulated, embodied revelation. And at the end, a paradox collapses into clarity. The tribes have been found and are still being found. Found in the genealogies of small communities that refuse to surrender their distinct memories. Found in the unification of Judah and northern elements that became the people known to Rome and Babylon, to Europe and Arabia, to India and Africa, simply as Jews. Found in the way prophecy rests not on a single GPS coordinate, but on a living people assembling and reassembling under a covenant that outlasts regimes. The search ends where the Bible points without detour. In the people who kept the Sabbath, told the stories, taught the names, and returned when doors opened.